The frozen creek had no business being so beautiful, and Rebecca Dalton had no business standing at its edge in the kind of cold that turned breath into ghosts and turned good intentions into grave markers. It was the winter of 1873, deep in the Colorado Territory, where the Rocky Mountains rose like the jagged teeth of some ancient creature, and the wind came down off the peaks without mercy or apology. Rebecca had been riding her mare, a steady bay called Juniper, out toward the Callaway homestead some 4 miles east of the small town of Harlow Creek, where she served as the only midwife within 40 miles in any direction. Clara Callaway had been 8 months along and had sent word by her eldest boy, a gap-toothed 10-year-old named Thomas, that she was feeling pains that came too early and too sharp. Rebecca had not waited. She had wrapped herself in her heaviest wool cloak, tied her leather bag of instruments and herbs behind the saddle, and ridden out into the late afternoon as the sky turned the color of a bruise. She had not expected the temperature to drop as fast as it did. She had not expected the snow that came sideways off the North Ridge, thick and blinding, the kind of snow that erased landmarks the way a hand erases chalk from a board. She had not expected Juniper to pull up lame on a root hidden beneath a shallow drift, going down hard on her right foreleg, and throwing Rebecca off with a startled sound that echoed through the trees. Rebecca had landed in the snow and come up shaking, not from the fall but from the cold that had already begun working through her wool layers, and she had checked Juniper first before herself, because that was the kind of woman she was. The mare was not badly hurt, but she would not carry a rider, not that night, and Rebecca had made the hard choice to tie her to a pine bough with enough slack to shift her weight off the bad leg, leaving her the warmth of her own coat as a kind of apology. She had walked. She had walked in the direction she believed was east, following what she thought was the creek trail, because the creek led to the Callaway land and the Callaway land meant a woman who needed her. But the snow had rearranged the world, and what Rebecca thought was the trail was only the memory of one, and she had come to the creek not at the ford she knew, but at a wide, shallow bend where the water had frozen solid in the drop of the last 2 days, or mostly frozen. The surface was glassy and pale and wrong-looking, and she had known better than to trust it with her full weight. She had circled the bend looking for a crossing, then circled back, then circled again, because the willows on the far bank were thicker and the snow made every angle look the same, and the cold had begun to steal the careful logic from her mind the way it stole heat from her fingers. That was where Jasper Winslow found her. He had come down off the ridge above the creek. In that particular way, he moved through the mountains, which was to say quietly, and with a certainty that came from 15 years of knowing these peaks the way most men know the lines of their own hands. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders in a way that made the word broad seem insufficient, with forearms like bundled cordwood, and a jaw that could have been cut from the same granite as the mountains he called home. His hair was dark brown and fell past the collar of his heavy buffalo coat, not from carelessness, but from the practical reality that barbershops were a luxury a man who lived alone in the high country did not often pursue. His eyes were the particular gray-green of creek water in shadow, and they missed very little. He had been out checking his trap line, which ran along the north side of this very creek bend, and he had heard the crunching of boots in snow before he saw her. At first he had thought it might be a deer, the way the sound kept circling without going anywhere. Then he had come through the last stand of spruce and stopped at the sight of a woman in a dark wool cloak pacing the frozen bank of the creek in the gray failing light, her arms hugged around herself, her breath coming in rapid white clouds. For a moment he simply watched, because what a man saw in these mountains was not always what he expected, and he had learned caution the hard way. But she was real. She was cold. She was in trouble. He stepped out from the trees and called to her across the creek bank, his voice carrying easily through the still air. "Ma'am, you all right over there?" Rebecca spun so fast she nearly lost her footing on the ice-crusted snow at the bank's edge. She caught herself and pressed a hand to her chest, and even from 20 feet away Jasper could see her face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with complexion and everything to do with exposure. She was pretty, sharply pretty, with dark eyes that were wide with surprise, and a set to her mouth that told him. She was the kind of woman who did not panic easily, but was currently working very hard to stay ahead of it. "I'm not all right," she said, and her voice was steady despite the trembling he could see in her shoulders. "I have been trying to cross this creek for the better part of an hour, and I cannot find a ford I trust. My horse has gone lame up the trail, and I have a woman waiting on me at the Callaway homestead who should not be waiting." Jasper took in all of this in a single beat. His eyes moved to the creek's surface, reading it the way he read everything out here, and he could see immediately why she had not crossed. The ice at the bend was false. It was thick enough near the banks, but there was a dark vein through the center where the current ran faster underneath, and if she had trusted it she would have gone through up to her knee at the least, which at this temperature would have been genuinely dangerous. He walked down to the bank and stepped out onto the ice without hesitation, testing it with each step in the methodical way of a man who has crossed 1,000 frozen creeks and knows exactly what good ice sounds like under his boots. He got 3 steps out and stopped. "It won't hold a full crossing," he confirmed, not loud, just stating it. "Current's been eating it from underneath for the last day and a half. The ford's a quarter mile downstream, but that's the long way in this dark and cold." He looked back at her. "I am Jasper Winslow. I trapped this ridge. You are the midwife from Harlow Creek, if I am not mistaken." She blinked, something shifting in her expression between irritation and relief. "Rebecca Dalton, and yes, how did you know?" "Only midwife within 40 miles, he said simply. "And your bag says what you are even if your face did not." "How long have you been out here in this cold, Miss Dalton?" "Rebecca," she said, then caught herself as if she had not meant to offer that quite so quickly. "And I have been walking since the mare went lame, which was perhaps an hour before I reached this bank." He took that in. He did not like it. The cold that had come down off the ridge in the last 2 hours was serious cold, the kind that went to work on a person in ways they did not always feel until the damage was already done, because the warmth of panic and exertion could mask what was happening to the skin and the extremities. He stepped back off the ice and came around the bank toward her, moving with that deliberate steadiness of his that some people found unnerving and that animals, in his experience, found reassuring. "Let me see your hands," he said. She looked at him as if that was an unusual request. "Your hands," he repeated gently. "Please." She pulled them from where she had tucked them under her arms and held them out. The fingers were pale at the tips in a way that told him she had maybe another 30 minutes of safe moving around before the situation became urgent, and he factored that into everything. "All right," he said. "We are going to cross this creek right now, and then we are going to get you to the Callaway place. The way there from the far bank is direct through the timber. I know it well." He paused. "There is one complication." She looked at him with those dark eyes, waiting. "I cannot get you across the ice without breaking through," he said. "Not safely. The ford at the quarter mile is too far in this cold and this dark without a torch, so I am going to carry you across on my back. I will test every step. The ice will hold me alone most sections, and where it won't, the water here is not deep, barely past my knee, and I have oiled my boots." A pause stretched between them while the wind moved through the pines above and sent a cascade of snow from the branches. "You will carry me," she said. "On my back, yes." She looked at the creek and then back at him, and he could see the precise calculation happening behind her eyes, the midwife's mind that was always weighing risk against risk, necessity against dignity. He respected it. "Clara Callaway needs me," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. "Then we go," she said. He turned his back to her and crouched down, not making a ceremony of it, just presenting his broad back and broad shoulders as a matter of practical utility. He heard her hesitate for a single breath, and then she stepped behind him and put her arms around his neck, and he reached back and caught her legs behind the knees, and she weighed less than he expected, which was to say she was slender beneath all that wool and cloak, and he felt her tighten her grip around his neck as he stepped toward the bank. The first 3 steps onto the ice were solid. He moved carefully, feeling the surface with each booted foot before shifting his weight, keeping most of it forward, distributing it across the width of his stride in the way he had learned from watching coyotes cross frozen water, which spread their weight instinctively. Rebecca did not make a sound, but he could feel her breath on the side of his neck, quick and warm, and he was aware of it in a way that was simply human, simply the proximity of another person in a cold and frightened world. The crack came at the center, exactly where he had expected it, a sharp sound like a rifle shot in the still air, and Rebecca made one short sound against his collar. But Jasper's foot had already found the bottom as the ice gave way, cold water flooding into his boot to the ankle, and he kept walking because stopping was the worst thing you could do. He took 4 long strides through shin-deep water, the cold of it extraordinary, and then the far bank was under his feet, and the ice was thick and reliable again, and he walked up the snowy bank without ceremony and kept going another 20 feet into the shelter of the pines before he set her down. She slid off his back and turned to face him immediately, and her expression was something he did not entirely have a word for, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that looked like she was seeing him clearly for the first time rather than as a fortunate stranger. "Your boots," she said. "Your feet." "They're all right," he said. "Cold, but I've had worse. The cabin is 2 miles north to change into dry boots, but you need to be at the Callaway place more than I need dry footwear tonight." He reached inside his buffalo coat and pulled out a wrapped piece of oilcloth that turned out to contain a dry pair of heavy wool stockings. He sat down on a snow-covered log without explanation and changed his boots in her wrapping, tucking the oiled wool tight, and was back on his feet in under 2 minutes. She was watching him with that same sharp attention that she had probably used her whole life to read the bodies of women in labor, the way a careful person reads the language that other people's bodies speak. He tried not to notice this too much. "The Callaways," he said, pulling his coat back around him. "Stay close behind me and walk in my tracks where you can. It will save your energy, and I know the ground." She fell in behind him without argument, and they moved through the timber together, and the snow came quieter here under the spruce canopy, and the world narrowed to the sound of their footsteps and the occasional crack of cold wood overhead. The Callaway homestead came out of the dark like a lantern promise, the yellow light in the windows warm and beckoning. Jasper knocked twice on the door, and it opened immediately to reveal Edgar Callaway, a raw-boned farmer of 40 with worry worn so deep into his face it had become a permanent feature. Behind him, from the back room, came a sound that told Rebecca everything she needed to know about the state of things, a low rhythmic groan that meant labor had progressed well past early. "Thank God," Edgar said, but he was looking past Jasper at Rebecca. "She's been like this for 2 hours. Thomas found me and told me you were coming, but the weather—" "I am here now," Rebecca said, and the authority in her voice was immediate and complete. She was already moving past both men toward the back room, pulling off her cloak as she went and handing it to Jasper without looking at him. He caught it. He stood in the main room of the Callaway cabin with Rebecca's cloak in his hands, while Edgar built up the fire and put on water the way men do when they have been told to do something useful and are grateful for the direction. Jasper set the cloak carefully over the back of a chair near the hearth where it would dry without scorching, and then he sat down to wait, because this was a thing he understood about his presence here. He was not needed in that room, but he was not leaving, not with Rebecca's lame horse still tied up on the trail in this cold, not with the ice on that creek between her and any road home. The sounds from the back room were the sounds of hard work, a woman's work that men in 1873 largely stood outside of and pretended not to hear. Jasper was not pretending. He listened because listening was a thing he did well, and through the closed door he could hear Rebecca's voice, steady and low and certain, saying things like, "You are doing beautifully, Clara," and "Breathe with me now," "That is exactly right." And the quality of that voice moved something in him that he could not immediately name. It was a voice that had authority without force. It was a voice that said, "I will not leave you." He thought about the way she had looked at him over the frozen creek, that precise calculation behind her eyes. He thought about the weight of her on his back, and the way her arms had tightened briefly when the ice cracked, and the warmth of her breath on his neck. He told himself not to think about those things, and then went ahead and thought about them anyway. Edgar Calloway fell asleep in his chair before midnight, and Jasper sat up by the fire with a cup of the worst coffee he had ever tasted, which Edgar had made with a confidence that was not matched by his skill, and he waited. The baby came at midnight with a cry that cut through the walls of the cabin and made Edgar jolt upright in his chair, and made Jasper feel, absurdly, the prickling of something behind his eyes that he would not have admitted to another living soul. Edgar was on his feet, and at the bedroom door before he was fully awake. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, and her face was flushed from effort and warmth and from something else, the particular radiance of a woman who had just done the most necessary work in the world. "You have a son," she told Edgar simply, and the man made a sound that was not quite words and pushed past her, and Rebecca stepped out into the main room and pulled the door nearly closed behind her and leaned against the wall with her eyes shut for a moment, just breathing. Jasper stood up from the fire and moved toward her without quite thinking about it. "All right?" he asked. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and she smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile, and it was not the small, polite smile of a woman being courteous to a stranger. It was the real thing, wide and warm, and reached all the way to her dark eyes, and it hit him somewhere between the ribs. "Both well," she said. "£8 if I had to guess. He came fast once he decided to come." She paused, pushing off the wall. "I need to go back in, but thank you, Mr. Winslow, for the crossing. For bringing me here." "Jasper," he said, because he had not yet offered her the reciprocal. She met his eyes. "Jasper," she repeated, and his name in her mouth was a perfectly ordinary thing that he was aware of in a way he had not been aware of many things in a long time. She went back into the bedroom, and he sat down again and drank the rest of the terrible coffee and looked at the fire. By 2 in the morning, Clara Calloway was resting and feeding her new son, and Rebecca had packed her bag and pronounced both mother and child healthy, and given Edgar enough detailed instructions about the next days that the man had written them on the back of an envelope with a stumped pencil. Jasper had in the meantime gone back out into the cold, retrieved Juniper from where Rebecca had left her, wrapped the mare's leg as best he could, and led her down to the Calloway barn, which was warm and adequately stocked with hay. Juniper would be fine there for a night. When he came back inside, Rebecca was standing by the fire with her cloak back around her shoulders and her bag in her hand, and she looked at him with those direct, dark eyes. "You went for my horse," she said. She needed to be in the warm. Rebecca looked at him for a moment. "You are a very practical man, Jasper Winslow." "Mostly," he agreed. "And a very kind one," she said, and said it simply enough that it was not a compliment so much as an observation, a fact she was adding to her record of the evening. It was far too cold and far too late to get her safely back to Harlow Creek that night. He said so, and she knew it too, and Edgar settled the matter immediately by pointing out the spare room with such insistence that there was no graceful way to refuse. Jasper took the pallet near the fire in the main room, and Rebecca took the spare room, and he lay awake for a while listening to the wind work at the eaves of the Calloway cabin, and thinking about a woman with dark eyes who walked toward frozen creeks without enough hesitation. He was up before the household and had coffee on, real coffee this time, from the decent tin he found in the proper place at the back of the shelf, when Rebecca appeared in the doorway of the main room. She had her dark hair pinned up but not entirely controlled, a strand loose at her jaw, and she was in the same dress but looked rested in a particular way that came from the kind of sleep that follows hard and purposeful work. She stopped when she saw the coffee and looked at him with something that was close to gratitude all over again. "That smells like actual coffee," she said. "Edgar's previous pot was a tragedy, Jasper said. "Sit down. It will be ready directly." She sat at the table and put her hands around the mug he set in front of her, and looked out the small, frost-rimmed window at the pale morning light beginning to come through the trees. The snow had stopped in the night, and the world outside was white and still and brilliant in the way that only fresh snow and morning light can be, which is to say it was brutally beautiful. "The weather has cleared," she said. "Should hold for today. We can get you back to town this morning before another front comes through." She turned to look at him across the table. In the morning light her face was very clear, and he could see things he had not quite been able to see by firelight or lantern. The intelligence that lived in her eyes, the fine lines at the corners that came from squinting into bright light or maybe from worry, the steadiness in her expression that he recognized as the particular kind of steadiness that a person cultivates because they cannot afford not to have it, because other people are always depending on it. "You live alone up here," she said. It was not quite a question. "For the last 5 years," he confirmed. "Had a partner in the trapping those first years after I came west, a fellow named Daniel Marsh. He went back east when his father died and left him some land in Ohio. I stayed." "Why did you stay?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because it was a real question and she was asking it as one. "I find it easier to think up here," he said. "The world down in the towns is loud in a particular way, not unpleasant but loud. Up here things are clear." She nodded slowly as if she understood this completely, and maybe she did. "What made you a midwife?" he asked, because it seemed only fair. She wrapped her hands tighter around her mug and something moved across her face, not pain exactly, but the shadow of something that had once been pain. "My mother," she said. "She died in childbed when I was 12, bearing my youngest brother. The midwife who attended her was an old woman, capable enough, but there was a hemorrhage and she did not know how to manage it properly. I was in the room." She paused. "I should not have been in the room, but I was, and I watched, and I decided right then that when I grew up I would know every way to manage everything that could go wrong, so that no child would have to watch their mother die of something that could have been prevented." The fire crackled in the silence that followed this, and Jasper thought that this was perhaps the bravest thing he had ever heard a person say, that a 12-year-old girl had stood in a room with grief and decided to turn it into purpose. "She would be proud of you," he said quietly. Rebecca looked at him with those dark eyes, and there was something naked in them for just a moment, something undefended, before she gathered it back behind the steadiness. "I hope so," she said. They sat there in the morning light with their coffee, and the cabin was quiet around them, and it was comfortable in a way that Jasper noticed, because comfortable was not a word he associated with the company of other people, not usually. He had grown accustomed to his own silence, had made a kind of home of it, but this woman's presence in it did not diminish it. It only changed its quality, made it warmer somehow. Edgar came out to make breakfast with more enthusiasm than skill, and they ate cornbread and salt pork and drank more of the decent coffee, and Clara sent word through Edgar that she wanted to thank Miss Dalton in person, and Rebecca disappeared into the bedroom for a while and came out looking moved in a quiet way. The baby, she reported, was nursing well and the color was excellent, and she had named him James. Jasper hitched Juniper, whose leg had rested enough for light walking, to the back of Edgar's wagon, and drove Rebecca back toward Harlow Creek himself with the mare following behind, while Edgar stayed with his new family. The road was slow in the fresh snow, but the sky was hard and blue, and the light coming off the mountains was the kind of light that painters went broke trying to capture. And Rebecca sat beside him on the wagon seat with her bag on her lap, and they talked. They talked about the mountains and about the town, and about the particular challenges of practicing medicine in a place where people were spread far apart and the weather did not negotiate. She told him about the cases she had attended, the difficult births and the easy ones, the women who had become her friends through the intimacy of it, the ones she had lost and carried in a different way. He told her about the mountains and the animals and the trap lines, about the seasons and the way the peaks changed through the year, about the elk herds that moved through the high meadows in autumn. He told her about the time a grizzly had come through his camp in the autumn of his second year, and had regarded him with the particular contempt that large predators have for smaller ones who are being inconvenient, and about how he had stood very still for a very long time, while the bear decided the camp was not worth the trouble. She laughed at that, a real laugh, a sound like water over stone, and he thought he would have told that story or any other story 1,000 times to hear that sound again. Harlow Creek revealed itself around a bend in the river road, a main street of perhaps 8 buildings, and a scattering of houses and cabins spreading up the hillsides, the whole thing presiding over by a water tower and a church steeple that were the 2 tallest structures for miles in any direction. It was the kind of town that was perpetually in the process of becoming, not quite frontier anymore but not yet settled, still carrying the rawness of a place that had been wished into existence by people who had decided this particular valley suited their purposes. He pulled the wagon up outside the small building that served as both Rebecca's residence and her practice, which announced itself with a modest painted sign, R. Dalton, Midwife and Nurse. She climbed down from the wagon and turned to look up at him, and the morning light was full on her face, and she was undeniably, genuinely beautiful in the straightforward way of a woman who does not think about being beautiful because she is too busy being competent. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. The crossing and the horse and the coffee and the company." "The pleasure was mine," he said, and meant it with the uncomplicated accuracy of a man who does not say things he does not mean. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the side of the wagon, and he had the very clear and inconvenient sense that she was not quite ready for him to drive away, and he knew with equal clarity that he was not quite ready to go. "I come into town most weeks," he said, "for supplies, every Thursday generally, sometimes Wednesday if the weather calls for it." She tilted her head slightly, and he could see her deciding something. "I am usually free in the late afternoons," she said. "If you wanted to take supper at the hotel sometime. It is not fine dining by any measure, but Mrs. Perkins makes an honest beef stew." "Thursday," he said. She smiled, and there it was again, that real smile that reached her eyes. "Thursday, then." He drove away without looking back, because he was the kind of man who believed in looking at what was in front of him. But he was aware of her presence behind him with a particular clarity all the way down the street and around the bend and up into the timber. And even after the town had vanished behind the trees, he could still see, precisely, the way she had looked standing in the morning light with her hand on the side of his wagon. He spent that Thursday doing his supply run with more care than usual, which was to say he changed his flannel shirt twice before settling on the cleaner one, and ran a comb through his hair, which was more preparation than he normally gave to anything in town. He arrived at the hotel at 5 o'clock to find Rebecca already there, seated at the table by the window in a dark blue wool dress that he had not seen before, which told him something, and her hair done up carefully, which told him the same thing. Mrs. Perkins' beef stew was indeed honest, and the corn bread was better than Edgar Calloway's by a considerable margin, and they sat across from each other in the warm lamplight of the hotel dining room, and talked for 3 hours while the evening settled around Harlow Creek, and the other 2 tables of diners came and went and came again. She asked him about his life before the mountains, and he told her about growing up in Tennessee, the youngest of 3 brothers, a farm that had been doing poorly before the war and had been doing worse after, and his decision at 19 to go west with nothing but his rifle and a letter of introduction to a man in Cheyenne who had never acknowledged receiving it. He told her about learning to trap from an old French-Canadian trapper named Beaumont who had spent 40 years in these mountains, and who had taught him everything he knew about reading the land and the animals and the weather, who had died 3 winters ago of a stroke in his cabin in the high country, and who Jasper had buried in the spring under a stand of aspens that Beaumont had always said was the best place in the mountains to be dead. She listened to all of it in the way that she listened to everything, which was to say fully, without performing attention, with the actual quiet attention of someone who is genuinely interested. She told him more about Harlow Creek, about the people there, the Hendersons who ran the general store and who were unfailingly generous with credit to the families who had bad seasons, about the doctor who had set up practice 18 months ago, a young man from Philadelphia named Dr. Amos Greer, who had come west with optimistic notions about adventure that the mountains had begun to thoughtfully revise, and about how she and Greer had an odd and productive partnership now, each handling what they understood best and consulting on the rest. She told him about the injustices she had seen and dealt with as a woman working in medicine in a time and place that had not yet decided how it felt about women doing such things. The dismissal of the older farmers who believed she was playing at it, the way certain men would send for her only when no other option existed, and then be ungracious about needing her, the way she had learned to move through all of it with a kind of principled patience that was not resignation but strategy. "I have learned," she said, picking at the last of her corn bread, "that the best argument for my presence is simply the work. Every child I bring safely into this world is an argument. Every mother who is alive and well because of what I knew to do is an argument. Eventually, most people come around. And those who don't," he asked. "Their opinions are not my business," she said, and the simplicity of it made him smile. He asked if she would walk with him through the town before the cold set in too far, and she said she would, and they walked down the main street of Harlow Creek together in the cold, clear evening, their breath mixing in the air between them, the mountains enormous and indifferent above the town, and they talked about smaller things, easier things, the kind of conversation that two people have when they have already established that the deeper things are available, but do not always need to be reached for. She stopped at the edge of town where the street ended and the road wound up into the timber, and they stood looking up at the mountains in the dark, the peaks edged with starlight, and she said something he would think about for a long time afterward. "I used to be afraid of this country," she said. "When I first came. I grew up in Missouri, in a town that had edges and limits and places where the land stopped and the ordinary world began. Out here the country just goes on and you cannot always tell where you fit in it." She paused. "But lately I think I might be starting to love it." "It gets in you," he agreed. "After a while you cannot imagine being somewhere smaller." She looked up at him, and they were standing close enough that he could see the particular brightness of her eyes in the starlight, and the moment had a specific gravity to it, a pull towards something that he was aware of with his whole self. He did not kiss her. She was a woman of considerable dignity, and they had known each other exactly a week, and he had some sense of what was due to someone like her. But he wanted to, and he thought from the way she held his gaze an extra moment before looking back at the mountains that she was aware of that, and that she was not entirely opposed to the general direction of it. He said goodnight at her door with his hat in his hands, and she said goodnight with that real smile, and he rode back up into the mountains in the dark, and the cold was nothing, and the stars were extraordinary. The Thursdays became a thing. Then the Wednesdays, too, when the weather allowed. And then some Tuesdays, when he had a reason to come to town that he was sometimes more deliberate about inventing than he would have admitted. He brought her a set of beaver pelts in early February that he cured and stretched himself, not as a demonstration of his work, but because she had mentioned in passing that her heavy winter blanket was wearing thin, and he thought of it every time he pulled a pelt from the stretching frame. She received them with her hands full of the soft fur and her eyes bright, and said they were the finest thing she had owned in 3 years, and he felt a satisfaction in that which was entirely disproportionate to the practical value of the gift. She gave him, in exchange, a bottle of tincture she had made herself from elderberry and wild ginger that she said was the best thing available for the kind of chest cold that the mountain winters produced, and she said it with the authority of her profession and the warmth of something more personal, and he drank it when the cold he got in February turned into exactly the kind of chest cold she had described, and he thought about her the whole time. Dr. Greer, whom Jasper met for the first time in late February at the hotel, turned out to be a good-natured young man of 26 with wire spectacles, and an air of someone who had recently revised his expectations about the West in a direction he was mostly at peace with, and who greeted Jasper with a handshake and an expression that said he had heard enough about him to have formed an opinion that was already broadly favorable. "Rebecca mentioned you," Greer said, with a diplomatic simplicity that covered several specific things. "She is a remarkable woman," Jasper said, with the directness that came from not seeing the point in being indirect. Greer looked at him over his spectacles in a way that was not without amusement. "She is that," he agreed. "I would argue she is the best practical medical mind in this county, including mine, and I will not say that in front of the county medical board because they would have an attack." "Does she know you think that?" Jasper asked. "I tell her regularly," Greer said. "She tells me to stop being obvious and write down what I know about treating infection instead." He paused. "I like you, Winslow." "I did not expect to, but I do." Jasper came to town one Wednesday in March to find the whole of Harlow Creek in a state of mild crisis around the Henderson store, which had caught a roof fire from a chimney spark, and which had been saved from total loss by a chain of townspeople passing buckets from the water trough. Rebecca was in the chain, sleeves rolled to the elbow, passing buckets with the rest of them, her hair coming loose from its pins and a streak of soot along her jaw. And she was telling the woman beside her the best treatment for minor burns with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who believes that useful information should be distributed freely and without ceremony. Jasper fell in beside her without being asked and took his place in the chain, and they worked side by side for 2 hours until the fire was fully out and the damage assessed, and the Hendersons reassured that the structural walls were sound and the stock mostly undamaged. Afterward, Rebecca sat on the step of the store with a cup of water and a streak of soot not only on her jaw but on her nose, and she looked up at him as he stood over her, and something passed between them that was entirely comfortable and entirely certain. "You always seem to appear when there is trouble," she said. "You always seem to be in the middle of it," he replied. She laughed. He sat down beside her on the step. They were close enough that their arms pressed together, and neither of them moved away from that, and he was very aware of her warmth alongside him in the cold March air. "Jasper," she said quietly after a moment, "what do you want from this?" He looked at her, and she was looking straight ahead at the street, and there was no ambiguity in the question. She was a direct woman, and she was asking him directly. "You," he said, also directly, because there was no point being otherwise. She turned to look at him, and her expression was not surprised. It was something else, something that was relief in the way that a thing you already know being confirmed is a relief, and she held his gaze with those dark eyes, and he held it back. "I have been trying very hard not to make assumptions," she said, "because I am a practical woman, and practical women do not make assumptions about men who come to town every week and bring beaver pelts." "You should make that assumption," he said. "It is not an assumption. It is a fact I have been attempting to communicate clearly for 3 months." She looked at him for another moment, and then she put her head down and laughed in that water-over-stone way, and then she looked back up, and he reached over and with one careful thumb wiped the soot from her nose, and she went still under the touch, her eyes steady on his. "I should like you to court me," she said, "in whatever way that means for a man who lives in the mountains and values clarity." "It means," he said, "that I will come to town every week and bring you things I have made or found that I thought you would like, and I will eat supper with you and walk with you and tell you every true thing I know, and eventually I will ask you to marry me." The words came out with a calm certainty that came from having been thought about very carefully since approximately 4 days after the frozen creek. She searched his face. "And if I said I was not interested in marrying, then I would ask what you were interested in and work from there," he said. She smiled, and it was the widest, realist version of that smile yet, and she said, "Court away, Jasper Winslow." He did. Spring came to Harlow Creek, and to the mountains above it in the extravagant, slightly frenzied way that spring always comes to the high country, as if the land had been holding its breath for 5 months and was now releasing everything at once, wild flowers and snowmelt and birds and green in every gradation. He took her riding when Juniper's leg was fully healed, and he showed her the high meadow above the creek where the elk wintered, and she sat on her horse in the spring light and watched a cow elk and her new calf at the far edge of the meadow, and she was very quiet in the particular way of a person who is being genuinely moved and knows it. He showed her his cabin for the first time in late April, which was a significant thing, and both of them knew it. It was not a small cabin. He had spent 3 years on it, adding and improving, and it sat on a south-facing shelf above the creek with a view of the main ridge that was, Rebecca said, something that should not be allowed to exist outside of a painting. He had put up bookshelves because he read, which she found out that day and which clearly delighted her, and the shelves were full of an eclectic and revealing collection of everything from natural history to Shakespeare, to whatever volumes he could find in the general store or persuade Edgar Calloway to bring back from Denver when the man made his seasonal supply run. She moved through his cabin with the careful attention she brought to everything, touching the spines of books and examining the tools on his workbench and looking at the view from the main window with her arms folded. And when she turned back to him, her expression was something he had not seen on her before, which was a kind of softness that she did not usually let show, as if being in the place where he lived had made him somehow more real to her, more dimensional. "You are a deeply surprising man," she said. "In what way?" "I expected a lean-to and a dirt floor. I have lived in lean-tos," he said. "I did not find them entirely satisfying." She laughed and looked around again and said, "This is a very good home." "It is better with you in it," he said. She met his gaze and did not look away, and the light through the window was warm on her face, and he crossed the room to where she was standing, and she tilted her face up and he bent down and kissed her, finally, softly, with the patience of a man who has been planning this and the tenderness of one who means it entirely. She kissed him back with a certainty that was entirely her own, her hand coming up to his jaw, and the warmth of it was extraordinary against all that mountain air. They stood there in the afternoon light in his cabin above the creek, and when they finally stepped apart she was looking at him with her hand still at his jaw, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it. "I am falling in love with you," she said, with the practical, dignified directness of a woman who has decided there is no tactical advantage to pretending otherwise. "I have loved you since the frozen creek," he said. "Since before, probably. Since I heard your voice across the water and knew immediately that you were someone who ran toward the things that needed you." Her eyes were bright. She pressed her forehead briefly against his chest, and he put his arms around her carefully, as if she were something extraordinarily valuable that he was being trusted to hold, and they stayed like that while the creek ran below the cabin and the mountains went about their enormous indifferent business above them. She rode back down to Harlow Creek that evening with her heart full of something she had not entirely expected to find in this country, in this work, in this particular year of her life. She had come to Colorado 3 years ago with a purpose and a grief, and a quiet resolution that had left very little room for the softer things. She had thought that was sufficient. She was discovering it was not, or rather, that it did not have to be. The summer of 1873 was warm and bright and full of the particular business of a town and a mountain range that were both in the process of becoming themselves. Rebecca attended 12 births between May and August, which was a testament to the ambitions of the Harlow Creek settlers regarding families, and she lost none of them, and she added each healthy child to the running account she kept in her mind of the arguments she was making every day for her own necessity. Jasper came to town every week without fail and went back up to the mountains and came back again, and gradually the people of Harlow Creek formed opinions about this, which is to say they decided it was a fine thing and occasionally said so. Mrs. Henderson, who was the closest thing the town had to a social architect, told Rebecca at the dry goods counter in June that Jasper Winslow was as fine a man as this territory has produced, which Rebecca thought was a peculiar phrase for a Tennessee-raised man who had arrived in Colorado at 19, but she appreciated the sentiment. He took her to the summer dance that the town organized in July, which was held in the cleared space behind the livery stable with a fiddle player from Denver, who had come west for reasons he was vague about, and who played magnificently. Jasper danced with her, which surprised her because she had not thought of him as a dancing man, and he danced the way he did everything, with a quiet, sure competence and an awareness of her that was both physical and attentive, and she thought that there was not an inch of her that was not thoroughly and completely in love with him by the time the fiddle started its third song. He asked her to marry him in September, on the high meadow above the cabin at sunset, when the aspens had gone gold and the light on the mountains was the color of old honey. He had not made a production of it. He had simply stopped the horses and gotten off his horse and held out his hand to help her down, and then held both her hands in his enormous ones and looked at her and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life being the person who is present for the things that are important to you. I want to come down off this mountain every day for the rest of my days for the purpose of being wherever you are. Will you marry me, Rebecca Dalton?" She said yes before he had quite finished the question, and the certainty in her voice was the same certainty she brought to everything, which was to say it was absolute and without reservation. He had a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a simple gold band that he had carried from Tennessee in the bottom of a pack for 12 years, not knowing quite why he had kept it through all the moving and the rough years, and now he knew, and he slid it onto her finger, and she held her hand up and looked at it in the golden light with her eyes bright. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said, with a simplicity that made it the largest thing that had been said in that meadow in quite some time. They were married in October, in the little white church on the hill above Harlow Creek, with Dr. Greer and Mrs. Henderson and Edgar and Clara Calloway and half the town in attendance. The Reverend Thomas Bly read the service in his deliberate, careful way, and Rebecca said her vows looking directly at Jasper with those dark eyes steady and clear, and he said his looking back at her, and the whole church was very quiet because the quality of what was happening between them was visible to everyone present, the kind of love that does not perform itself but simply exists, plainly and openly, like the mountains. After the service, Mrs. Henderson and several other women of the town had organized a dinner in the hotel dining room that was considerably more elaborate than Mrs. Perkins' usual offerings, including a spiced cake that had come from a recipe Mrs. Henderson guarded as if it were a legal document, and the people of Harlow Creek ate and drank well and danced in the street, despite the October cold, and told each other stories about the couple in tones of genuine warmth. Edgar Calloway told anyone who would listen about the night in January when a stranger had appeared out of the storm with the midwife on his back, having carried her across a frozen creek, and if the story improved slightly in the telling, no one objected because the essential truth of it was entirely accurate. Jasper Winslow had found the stranded midwife and carried her across and stood in his kitchen drinking bad coffee until a new life was safely in the world. And now here they were in October with a gold band on her finger and a look in both their eyes that said the frozen creek had been the beginning of the best thing either of them had ever stumbled into. They went up to the mountain cabin that night as married people, and the cabin was warm from the fire Jasper had laid before they went down to church. And Rebecca stood at the big window looking at the night mountains and the stars while he came up behind her and put his arms around her and rested his chin on the top of her head. And the world was very quiet and very clear and entirely sufficient. The winter that followed was the first winter Rebecca had spent in the mountains rather than in the town, and she had feared briefly that it would be isolating in a way that would test her, but she had underestimated both Jasper and the mountain. He had set things up so that she could get to town on any day the weather permitted, and on the days it did not permit, there was enough between them to fill the hours without difficulty. They read in the evenings by the fire, sometimes aloud to each other, and they argued cheerfully about the relative merits of various books in a way that was one of the quiet pleasures of the winter. He taught her to read the weather coming off the peaks, and she taught him about the medicinal plants that grew in the high meadows, showing him her dried and pressed collections from the autumn, with the focused enjoyment of a person sharing something they love with someone who is genuinely interested. Dr. Greer rode up to the cabin once a month through the winter to consult, because he had decided early that losing Rebecca's expertise to the mountains was not an option, and that monthly ride became a fixture that all three of them looked forward to in different ways. He brought news from town, and she sent back notes and instructions for cases she was managing by correspondence, and occasionally he brought supplies she needed, and she sent him back with cures she had been working on, and Jasper made sure Greer's horse was fed and watered, and that the young doctor had hot food before he rode back down in the afternoon. Greer told Jasper one February afternoon, while Rebecca was inside making tea and they were both standing in the cold air looking at the view that should not be allowed to exist outside of a painting, that Rebecca was happier than Greer had ever known her to be. She was never unhappy, Greer said carefully. She was always purposeful and able, but there was something in her that was reserved, held back. It is not held back now. Jasper looked at the mountains. She has never been held back with me, he said, not from the first night. I know, Greer said, that is not nothing. Spring came again, and with it the news that Rebecca was expecting. She told him in April, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea and her eyes watching his face, and what moved through him was a warmth so complete and so total that he did not have adequate words for it. So he came around the table and crouched in front of her chair and took her hands and held them and looked at her. "Are you well?" he asked first, because he was married to a midwife and knew that this question was not simple. "Very well," she said, and her voice was steady and warm. "I am 4 months. I have been waiting to be certain before telling you." 4 months, he said. "You have been certain for 4 months and you waited." "I am a cautious woman," she said. "You walked toward a frozen creek in the dark in January," he pointed out. She laughed. "That was professional necessity." He pressed his forehead against their joined hands and felt the weight and warmth of what this was, a life they had made together. In this country they had both chosen, with this particular woman who had decided to walk toward the things that needed her and had, in doing so, walked toward him. He built a cradle in the late spring evenings from pine boards he had cured himself, working it smooth and carving a small pattern of spruce branches around the headboard, because he had that kind of patience with wood, and because the making of it was a way of doing something with all the feeling that was too large to simply hold still. Rebecca moved back down to Harlow Creek for the last 2 months of her pregnancy, not because she feared the cabin, but because she and Dr. Greer agreed it was sensible to be closer to assistance, and Jasper came down with her and spent those 2 months in town, which was the longest he had spent at lower elevation in 5 years, and which he found he did not mind because she was there, and the people of Harlow Creek turned out to be decent company when he gave them the chance. He became, in those 2 months, a recognizable presence on the main street of Harlow Creek, the large, quiet man with the long dark hair who sat outside the Henderson store reading, or who helped the blacksmith with heavy work when an extra pair of hands was needed, or who could be found most evenings at Rebecca's house with the lamp on, and the sound of their voices coming through the window, in tones of conversation and occasional laughter, that the neighbors found quietly reassuring. Their son was born in November of 1874, just over a year after the frozen creek and the terrible coffee, and the first of those Thursdays. He came into the world in the back room of Rebecca's house in Harlow Creek with Dr. Greer attending, because Rebecca had decided firmly that she was not delivering her own child. regardless of her professional opinion of her own competence. And Jasper had held her hand through the whole of it, and been the kind of steady, present, enormous mountain of a man that a woman needed beside her in those hours, not trying to fix or direct or manage, only being there, completely and without reservation. Greer put the baby in Jasper's arms first, which was an unconventional decision for 1874, but which Greer made without ceremony. And Jasper held his son in his large hands and looked at the red, furious, perfect face, and was entirely undone in the quiet way that does not show on the outside but which is total. They named him Thomas, after the Callaway boy who had ridden for help in the snowstorm, and so had set everything in motion. They thought it was a fitting name for a child, who would not have existed without that particular cold January night, and the choices it had precipitated. Rebecca healed well and Thomas thrived, and the winter of 1874 to 1875 was spent largely in town, because Jasper had decided, without making a formal announcement of it, that his life was now principally where Rebecca was, and that the mountain was available to him, but was not his primary purpose. He kept his trap lines and spent time in the high country and knew the mountains the way he always had, but the cabin became a place they went together rather than a place he went alone, and the difference was everything. He built a proper house on the east edge of Harlow Creek in the spring of 1875, with lumber from the mill in the next valley and help from half the town, who arrived on a Saturday in April with tools and goodwill, and went home in the evening, having raised the frame of something that was solid and considered and clearly intended to last. Rebecca stood in the middle of the framed rooms with Thomas on her hip, pointing at where she wanted the kitchen window, and where the examining room should go, and Jasper stood behind her with his arms folded looking at what they were building and feeling that same profound, wordless satisfaction he had felt looking at her with his grandmother's ring on her finger in the golden September meadow. The house was finished by June, with a room set aside for her practice that had good northern light and space for the instruments and medicines, and the writing desk where she kept her records of every birth she attended, going back to her first year in Colorado. He put bookshelves in the main room, real ones, built into the wall the way he had seen it done in a house in Cheyenne once and had thought about since, and they filled them with the combined contents of both their book collections, which turned out together to cover a considerable range. Rebecca's practice expanded with the town. Harlow Creek was growing, as the Colorado Territory was growing, more settlers every season, more families taking up land in the valleys and the lower slopes, more children being born in more homesteads spread across the high country. Rebecca rode out to attend them all, and Jasper sometimes rode with her when the routes were long or the weather was uncertain, not to interfere with her work, but to make sure she got there and got home, which was a thing she accepted with a grace that came from understanding that the people who love us are entitled to worry in the ways that make sense to them. There was a girl born in the summer of 1876, the second of their children, whom they named Catherine after Rebecca's mother. She came easier than Thomas had, or so Dr. Greer said, and Rebecca held her in the quiet hour after the birth with a look on her face that Jasper had seen before, but that never became ordinary to him, that particular radiance of a woman who has just done the most necessary work in the world and knows it. He sat beside her on the bed and looked at his daughter, who had dark eyes that were already, despite being approximately 4 hours old, showing signs of having opinions about things, and he thought about a 12-year-old girl standing in a room with grief and deciding to turn it into purpose, and about how that girl had become the woman beside him who had probably saved this child's life 3 times before it was even born, just by being who she was. "Catherine," Rebecca said softly, looking at her daughter. "Your grandmother would have loved you. She would have loved your mother," Jasper said. Rebecca looked at him and her eyes were bright and soft. "Thank you for knowing what to say." "I only said the true thing," he replied. By 1878, Harlow Creek had grown enough that Dr. Greer had taken on an assistant, a young woman fresh from a nursing school in Boston, who had come west with opinions about the frontier that the frontier was currently revising, and who had the good sense to spend her first 3 months learning everything Rebecca would teach her. Rebecca took the teaching seriously and thoroughly, because this was precisely the thing she had wanted when she was 12 years old, standing over her mother, someone who knew more than was available. The town had a proper school by then, and Thomas started it in the fall of 1878, a small boy with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's habit of observing things with careful attention, who could already read and who regarded the classroom with the enthusiasm of someone discovering that other people had also found the world interesting. Catherine, 3 years old and formidably determined, was furious at being left behind and made this known in clear terms. Jasper had, by this time, largely given up the trapping as his primary livelihood, because the cabin above the creek had grown into something larger, and the mountains he had always worked were beginning to see more people and fewer animals, and because the town had need of a man who could build things and knew the high country and was entirely unintimidated by the physical demands of both. He built houses and barns and helped survey the road north that the county was putting through in stages, and rode with the informal group of men who occasionally helped the town marshal keep the peace in the way that frontier towns managed such things, which was to say, with a combination of authority and practicality. He was good at it because he was large enough that most situations resolved themselves without escalation, and because he had the kind of patient, certain presence that made angry men reconsider their plans. They had a third child in the spring of 1879, another boy, whom they named after Jasper's father with slight modification, calling him James rather than the full William James, which was what the father had gone by. The name also honored the Callaway baby, the first James who had been born on the worst night of Rebecca's first Colorado winter, which felt like a full circle of a kind that the both of them appreciated. Edgar Callaway, when he heard the name, stood in the yard of his homestead and looked at Jasper with the particular expression of a man who is not accustomed to being moved but finds himself moved anyway. "That is a fine name," Edgar said. "We thought so," Jasper said. "Clara will want to know," Edgar said, and went inside to tell his wife, and there was a sound from the kitchen that could have been Clara crying, and it almost certainly was. The years in Harlow Creek settled into the particular rhythm of a life that is full without being frantic, shaped by the seasons and by the work and by the people in it. Rebecca delivered babies all across the county and trained 3 women in the skills of midwifery over the following decade, because she believed deeply in the multiplication of the capability she carried, in making sure that more women knew what she knew so that the thing she had wanted at 12 could exist in more places than just where she was. She kept her meticulous records and corresponded with medical organizations in the East who were only beginning to think formally about the training of midwives as a discipline, and some of what she wrote to them was eventually incorporated into materials that were used in places she would never see. Dr. Greer stayed in Harlow Creek, which had been uncertain for a while because he had been offered a position in Denver that was more prestigious and considerably better paid, and he turned it down, and when Rebecca asked him why, he said that the work in Harlow Creek still needed doing, and that he trusted no one else to do it with him, which was partly true and partly the other thing that had been quietly developing between him and the Boston nursing school graduate, who turned out to have more depth and more staying power than either of them had initially assessed, and who married him in 1879 and gave him very happy reasons to remain in the high country. Thomas grew up serious and kind, and with his mother's gift for careful attention and his father's gift for stillness under pressure, and when he was old enough he read everything on those bookshelves and asked his parents for more. And when the school teacher retired in 1889, Thomas, at 15, already knew more than several of the visiting teachers who had passed through, And eventually he went east to study and came back, which was the important part. Came back with a degree, and his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and set himself up as the schoolteacher that Harlow Creek had been making do without since old Patterson had retired. Catherine grew up with her grandmother's name and her mother's will and her father's certainty about what she wanted, and what she wanted turned out to be medicine, which in 1893 was no longer the impossible aspiration it had been in Rebecca's day, merely a very difficult one, and Rebecca helped her pursue it with the full force of everything she had learned about persistence and about the power of doing the work as the best argument for your right to do it. James, the youngest, was simply himself, which was cheerful and capable and possessed of a gift for the mountains that his father recognized immediately, and which meant that from the time James could walk, he was up in the high country with Jasper whenever the seasons and the school calendar allowed, learning the same things Jasper had learned from old Beaumont, the reading of the land and the animals and the weather, and carrying it forward into a century that would need people who still knew how to do that. The cabin above the creek was not abandoned. They went back to it every summer as a family, camping in the high meadows that Rebecca had come to love as fully and deeply as she had come to love everything about this country that she had once been afraid of. Jasper would stand at the edge of the high meadow in the summer light with his children around him and his wife beside him, her hand in his, and look out at the range of peaks that he had known for 20 years, and feel the particular completeness of a man who has found the life that was meant for him. In the late summer of 1895, Rebecca and Jasper walked up to the high meadow above the cabin alone for the first time in many years, the children being grown and away, and they sat on a flat rock in the afternoon light with the aspens beginning to think about turning and the mountain air cool and perfect around them. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they looked out at the country they had made their lives in. "Do you remember the frozen creek?" she asked. "I remember every minute of it," he said. "You were circling back and forth on that bank like you were arguing with it." "I was," she said. "I was very certain I could reason out a crossing if I thought about it long enough." "You were wrong," he said. "Yes," she agreed comfortably. "I was wrong. It required you." He pulled her a little closer. "It required us." She tilted her face up and looked at him the way she had looked at him that morning in the Callaway kitchen over real coffee, fully and clearly and without reservation. He was 53 now, and his dark hair had gone considerably gray at the temples, and the lines in his face were deeper from sun and weather. But his eyes were the same gray-green creek-water color they had always been, and his arms were still the arms of a man who had spent his life doing work that required something of them. And the way he looked at her had not changed by 1 degree in 22 years. She put her hand on his jaw, as she had on that day in the cabin when he had kissed her for the first time, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, and the mountains went about their enormous, indifferent, gloriously beautiful business above them. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For stepping out of those trees," she said. "For the creek, for all of it." He held her gaze, this woman he had loved since before he had words for it, this woman who had walked toward the things that needed her and in doing so had walked straight into the center of his life and stayed there, steadily and certainly, with those dark eyes and that real smile and the practical, purposeful, endlessly generous heart of her. "I would cross every frozen creek in this territory for you," he said. "I would do it barefoot." She laughed, that water-over-stone laugh that was still the finest sound he knew, and she pressed her forehead against his chest for a moment in that way she had done on the day she had told him she was falling in love with him, and he put his arms around her and held on. The mountains were gold and blue and enormous all around them. The creek ran below the cabin as it had always run. The aspens were on the verge of the great annual performance of their turning, and the world was exactly as large and as sufficient as it had always been. And Jasper Winslow held his wife in the high meadow above the creek, where he had learned the shape of the life he was meant for, and was entirely and completely and quietly at peace. Below them in Harlow Creek, In the house with the bookshelves built into the wall, Thomas was probably reading. Catherine was probably corresponding with her medical supervisors in Denver about a case she found interesting. James was probably up on a ridge somewhere reading the weather coming off the peaks. Dr. Greer and his wife were probably having their evening supper at the hotel, occupying the same table by the window where Jasper and Rebecca had first sat across from each other and talked for 3 hours and started, without knowing quite how, to build this. And on the hillside above the Calloway homestead, 4 miles east, a young man named James Calloway, 21 years old, the baby born on the night of the frozen creek, was probably thinking about the Hendersons' second daughter in the particular distracted way of someone who has not yet admitted to themselves what is happening, while the mountain winter gathered on the ridge above, and the creek ran cold and clear below, and the country went on being itself. Wild and beautiful and full of the unexpected grace of two people finding each other in it. None of it was inevitable. All of it had happened. The road between a mountain and a frozen creek and a woman circling it in the dark is not a long road in miles. In everything else, it is the longest road there is, the one that takes you from the person you are alone to the person you become with someone who sees all of it and stays. Jasper Winslow had walked down that road in the winter of 1873 in buffalo coat and oiled boots with cold water in his boots and a woman on his back, and he had walked it every day since in every weather and season, and he would tell you, if you asked him, that it was the best road he had ever found in 20 years of knowing these mountains, and that he would walk it again from the first step without changing a single thing. The aspens turned that week, all at once the way they always did, and the mountain was gold fire against the blue sky, and Rebecca Dalton Winslow looked out at it from her husband's arms and thought that this country, this enormous, indifferent, brutal, magnificent country, had given her everything she had not known she needed, and that she was going to spend the rest of her life being grateful for a lame horse and a frozen creek, and the particular good fortune of a mountain man who stepped out of the trees at the right moment, and said, simply and without drama, that he was going to carry her across.